Thank you, everyone, for being on time. Hello, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining this webinar today on creating social stories and visuals to support routines. My name is Liz Jewell, and I work as the Family Support Counsellor with Fragile X Association Australia. In a moment, we will be introducing our presenter, Helen Tozer. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owner of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. And so to our webinar this evening, it is my very great pleasure to introduce our presenter for tonight's webinar on creating social stories and visuals to support routines. Helen Tozer has a degree in early childhood education. She is a mother of two teenagers, and her son Josiah was diagnosed with Fragile X syndrome 12 years ago. Helen understands just how important simple, predictable routines can be for families, and in this session, she will share what really works for her family, keeping it practical, real life, and doable. Her hope is that you will leave this webinar with small steps and ideas to make routines and adventures feel calmer, more manageable, and more connected for everyone. There will be an opportunity to ask Helen questions after her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming tonight. As said, we're going to be talking about visual schedules and social stories and just some of the practical tools that have helped make daily routines and adventures more manageable for our family. And when I say adventures, I mean things like going to a restaurant, getting on an aeroplane, celebrating family occasions, and also dealing with big emotions. My hope for tonight is that you'll leave with just one small step of something that you can try, whether that's your morning routine, bedtime, preparing for your next outing, one thing that might make life feel a bit calmer for everyone. I've got my ducks in a row. I hope you enjoy the image there. It is slightly sarcastic. So I am sharing what works and what doesn't work, and we are figuring it out together. I am not an expert. I don't have all the answers, but hopefully from what I can share, something will resonate with you and your family. Okay, take a deep breath, everyone. Let's go. So my first piece of advice is to choose one thing to work on. Okay, just one. There's so many different areas that we could work on, and it can feel paralyzing. And, where do I start? So my advice is to start with your biggest pain point or your biggest challenge you have at the moment. So what's making life hardest for you right now? So for example, one point toileting was a big issue for us. But then when I actually narrowed it down a little bit further, it was toileting in the mornings. And then when I got a little bit more specific, it was actually making sure he went to the toilet for long enough in the mornings. And then I noticed later on, it was things like Friday afternoons was when we were having the most accidents. And as I reviewed that, I realized it was because I was tired. And by Friday afternoon, I didn't have the energy to keep on going. And so then the solution wasn't a story or something. It was actually a support worker to help me on a Friday afternoon. And so it was just that one thing that we changed that helped make the difference. So if you have a pen and paper or a note on your phone, I'd love to just pause for 20 seconds or so for you to name what's the biggest challenge or pain point you have right now. Okay, so just take a few moments. So as I'm talking, I hope that you'll think back to that challenge that you have at the moment and see, oh, can this help with that or not? And then you'll have your next steps. Also, if you've got questions about that point, we can discuss it afterwards. Now, I am going to be referring to children and kids tonight. the overarching principles actually apply to all ages and all stages. So I hope you don't get too offended by, it could be a young person. I have a teenager as such. And you'll also find that some of these strategies we actually use for ourselves, for Mike, for me, for our carers, they all kind of work. So the progression of visual communication tools. The first thing to understand is it's not a one size fits all. Every child, young person is at a different developmental stage, and that's got nothing to do with their chronological age. And it's also sometimes different on different days. We all have good days and not so good days, and our level of understanding can change. So typically, children start with concrete visuals and gradually move to those more abstract presentations as they develop. So, as you can see on the slide, a visual could just be the actual object. So, in this case, it's a shoe, and it may simply be it's time to put your shoe on. So, you hold the shoe and say it's time to put the shoe on. Another progression from that is a real photo of the object. So in point 2, you can see Josiah's shoes down there. You'll see that we're using a picture, a stylized picture, which is the pecs with the picture and the word underneath. And then the most abstract is just text. So, and shoes, which is, as you can see, not even very well written, and that's my handwriting. So here's something. We have to start with where our child is and then go forward. So I wish that was something that I knew at the beginning, because if you've never used visual schedules at home before, you just can't expect them to work instantly. We don't expect babies to read from whiteboard schedules, or we don't expect them to be able to speak at 6 weeks, but then we also don't talk to them like they can't understand. So we start with where our child's level is of understanding on both a bad day and the option for the good day, and then we work from there. Quite often you'll hear is, oh, visual schedules don't work, they just throw them away. Well, I want to say that visual schedules, that if a child throws a visual or rubs out a whiteboard, celebrate that, because it actually means they understand what you're asking and they're telling you that they don't want it. The fact that they still need to go and do the thing, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But visual routines do take time to become part of the family routine, especially if you haven't used it before. We actually started using morning schedule roughly 8 years ago after attending a webinar. Oh, no, not a webinar. We didn't have that back in those days. After attending a workshop on using them. So this sample that you've got up here is the first one we had. So it's 4 steps: get dressed, eat breakfast, brush teeth, shoes on. And the pictures were all there of pecs, and they were cut out laminated pieces. And then we would, at the time, we would dress Josiah, and then we take that get dressed visual and stick it onto the finished thing, because our kids love that finished. And we also learned during that time that they love to see the whole picture with a very clear beginning, middle, and end. And so we've applied those sort of principles from this into different elements. And I would say that we use this template for maybe 2 or 3 years. And to start with, probably only 50% of the time. We didn't use it in school holidays. We probably only used it when the days got harder. And I sort of, like, maybe we should try this thing again. but we still, we kept on using it. So some of the things as we progressed, we had a few breakthrough moments as such. And a real game changer for us was when my husband, Mike, figured out how much the iPad was a motivator for Josiah. And then we created a new visual, and that was the iPad with a 10-minute timer. And the process of like first and then, two very simple, it says two-step communication, but it's really of like understanding first this happens, then this happens. If those 4 steps are too hard, you sometimes have to come back to the 2. So for us, get dressed, then iPad, finally stopped the meltdowns. Well, I stopped, reduced the meltdowns, because he knew that there was a clear reward of getting dressed. And that was actually a massive difference. We used to have major meltdowns about getting dressed, and it wasn't just, and so one of the things that we helped was not just having a visual about getting dressed, but when it was a school morning, the visual of his school shirt, because he needed to understand that today was the day he was wearing a school shirt. So we then, a progression with adding a school shirt in instead of just a generic concept. I don't have an example here, but when we were adding in the toilet training into that visual schedule, we then added in, you can add in then and sitting on the toilet. And so it then became, we get dressed, we have breakfast, we waited the designated time to help things go through. We sat on the toilet, then we put our shoes on, and then it was time to go to the bus. So you can see that progression kept happening. So over time, we've built the complexity. So fast forward to nowadays, our visual schedule looks like this whiteboard version here. So this example that I put in here, I've intentionally chosen one that's not Pinterest ready and looking fabulous, because life is not like that. And this is how we do things. So when Josiah gets off the bus on a Thursday afternoon, each of his days look a little bit different. So this one is my afternoon as such. And each of those steps have become more complex. So as we've increased his independence, we've put things like he has to put his bag away, and he has to take his lunch boxes and, put them in the kitchen. And this one here, if you see it, I'm not sure if you can read on that, he was having trouble getting on the bus that morning. And so I said when he got home, he could have one biscuit, a chocolate biscuit, for walking onto the school bus. So I made sure that was there, because that's what I'd said. And so he had a delayed gratification as such. And, we've moved from making afternoon tea for him to helping him to make it himself. So each of those steps can then be expanded as we go. As I've said, the key point is that we built that foundation, and now 8 years later, Josiah is able to handle a detailed version of that. But we couldn't do that at the beginning. And if I'd tried to think we could do that 8 years ago, I would have laughed at you. In fact, 8 years ago, I laughed at the lady who suggested that I could wipe his face with a cloth. So, anyway, we'll keep going. So for us, we found that routines make things easier. I was told at the very beginning that once we establish his routines, it would be easier to add new tasks into his day. And I didn't really think that this was true, but I actually can tell you that it is absolutely true. Now I think about Josiah's day in chunks of routine. So his morning routine, his afternoon routine, his bedtime routine. Saturdays has a different routine. Sundays has a different routine. Holidays are completely different again. And so when I'm talking to an OT to try and introduce something new like handwriting practice, I can think about where it fits into his existing structure of the afternoon and what's going to work around that. So this has helped in so many different ways. Like I used to talking about that handwriting activity, it used to take me 45 minutes of meltdowns to get him to sit at the table for just 2 minutes of work. And it was exhausting for both of us. And it just was like, there's no way that this is sustainable. But now that he's actually a little bit older and that we have this pattern, it's been easier to add these fine motor things off. And we are now reaping the benefits of that. The other benefit to writing down the routines or your day or sections of your day is that when you're calm, it helps to minimize or reduce transitions. So transitions, e.g., like moving from one task to another, it's a classic Fragile X challenge. And Josiah is definitely, these are really hard for him, especially when you're going from one activity to a not preferred activity. So therefore, if I'm thinking about how his afternoon is going to go, I can then plan steps that include the preferred activities after the harder ones. And I can also plan in the sensory regulation strategies. So we've all heard about, making sure we have a sensory diet, but to actually incorporate that if you're thinking through. So, for example, we have swinging, like going for a swing in the schedules in the morning. And then after that, he has to empty the dishwasher. And so he's ready and he's calmer. And then he actually physically has to walk past the dishwasher before he goes on to the bathroom, which is normally a natural progression. So it's just thinking those things through really help you. Earlier this year, we were preparing for and went to visit family in the UK. And I realized that one of the major kind of pain points for us was going to be eating at restaurants. And this included part of the wedding. And so 8 months before our trip, we started intentionally practicing going to restaurants and cafes. And then out of that came this social story that I'll share with you. And how this works is that we've had the socials, the routines are the structure, but then the social stories teach the hows or the specifics of the steps in the routine and how to behave and what to expect in those different situations. So does that kind of make sense? I sort of see it as two different things. Well, they are. And so we're being explicit about what we want them to do. And so something that we're working on with Josiah is for him to acknowledge people coming in and saying hello. I can share this whole story with you, but the first thing was to say hello to the people and then sit at the table. Other times we've said to sit in the wheelchair or you can have a blanket over you, but we're teaching the expected behavior in a calm and visual way before the situation. And that takes away a lot of the anxiety for him and also for us. Because when we get anxious, he gets even more anxious. And then we lose our ability to A, enjoy ourselves and B, don't have a clearer head to help him cope better. So yeah, we've got templates that we're going to share later. So the other thing that we did as part of this big trip was another iteration of going on plane rides. So Josiah has traveled a bit as a small person. So it's been part of his life just because we've lived in Hong Kong and Boston and back here in Australia and have family in the UK. So as I was then preparing for this trip, I was thinking through, well, what are the things I'm anxious about for him? And what are the things I've identified, whether because he's hit his head the most or, he's going to run away. What are those pain points? So for Josiah, it was going through the actual checkout, like the security check-in, and it was getting off the plane. And so these iterations of the social story about the plane ride really focused in on what he did during those moments, and also then strategies to help. So you can see on the sample that I have here is that we thought through what are the rewards and what are the sensory supports that will use, and making sure we're articulating those things. So one of those things is wearing headphones, and we've been working for years on encouraging him to wear headphones, the 10 minutes as we call it, so a device. He loves Where's Wally, so we made sure we had a small new copy of that, and he had a blanket. We also thought about specific food rewards. And so Kit Kats have become a new tradition now for being on the airplane. And then again, it's thinking through the script about because you can find lots of social stories on websites, but sometimes the words that are used are not going to relate to what words your child understands. And so you can use those examples, but then sometimes we found you actually need to think through, well, I say 10 minutes for, having the iPad. And so that makes sense to him. So what makes sense for him? As you can see, the preparation, this trip, I will say, I don't make social stories like that airplane one every year. I mean, like every week. That was definitely a much bigger effort because it was a bigger example. So some of the other things that we do at home, we have what I've described his daily schedule. So like his morning routine is put into that whiteboard for us at the moment. But then so that tells him when to do things. And then we also have different social stories or guides in different locations that show him how to do those things. So as you can see here, my lovely bathroom, in his morning routine, there's listed brush teeth, but there's a separate visual in his bathroom that details each step of how to brush his teeth. And this has got both the words and the pictures and additions from me in terms of like count to 30, which the carer or myself can then do that. And so it's reminding him and prompting him in, an important tool. And you can see we've also teaching him to wear deodorant. And so I had to think through, well, where's the best place for him to put deodorant on? Well, it makes sense. He's in the bathroom. Let's have the additional prompt in there. But you've got to do what works for you. So if creating visual with laminating and all that sort of thing feels too overwhelming, or you can get stuck with it, delegation has been my newfound skill. And I have some amazing support workers, and one of them particularly is quite gifted. And she's helped. I've worked with her and she's created then using the board maker to create the visuals for us. And sometimes you just need to create a reward system for yourself to ensure that the new strategies are adopted. So I do this thing, then I can have, insert whatever. So I've sort of mentioned some of these things before about making them personal. So for sometimes Josiah more now doesn't need that level of the actual photograph of things, but he does love seeing his photo and he does love seeing his name. And when you are distinguishing between days of the week and what he needs to do, that visual support is still very important. We do use a combination of digital stuff and also analog per se. So, and the reason we we use the digital stuff and even the whiteboard is still quite, old school per se, is because the iPad is such a reward for him that it's hard to have everything based on an iPad. And so it just helps us step away from that. And throwing a laminated sheet is a lot cheaper than an iPad. It's the other thing. And yeah, finding what motivates your child can really be hard. It's not easy for everyone. For us, Josiah is very motivated by the iPad, certain snacks, particularly chocolate, and certain activities per se, but food and iPad are definitely a big draw card for him. In terms of tips for laminating, don't you may correct me if I'm wrong, but I think NDIS assists with these in terms of consumables. So the laminator, laminating films, and printer ink. Aldi also sell laminators that are very cheap and they do laminating sheets. And you can also get laminating business card size laminates. And they just, if you just need to do one, it makes it much easier and then becomes more waterproof. Velcro dots are super helpful. That's where you put exhibit A, you have a soft side and the harder side, and you can buy these in Bunnings, Spotlight, like dollar shops, that kind of thing. So when it will scroll down a little bit. So some of the stumbling block. Start with me, really. I am a Fragile X carrier, and I was diagnosed with ADHD probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And so at times my executive functioning is not great. And I don't enjoy sitting at the computer sometimes. In fact, this webinar has been quite a challenge for me. So I've had to learn to strategies and so some of the bigger hurdles I've had is trying to do too much at once. And so you can go to a workshop and get all excited and you can do all the things, but then you can burn out and nothing sticks. So start with just one routine, and build from there. Just either start with the mornings or start with the afternoons or whatever it is. Just give you permission to just go slow. 2 is trying to do it all by yourself. I can't stress enough that just doesn't work. Use your support workers if you have them, your partner, friends. Get your therapist making the visuals if you need them to. I also only ever asked my therapists, this particularly in the younger years, I only asked my therapist for one thing to do at a time because that was all I could handle. So if there was one word, like one language goal that we were going to have just for that week, or one physio goal, and that's okay because I can do one thing, I can't do a billion things. Talked a little bit less about understanding your needs. So recognize and respect your own executive functioning challenges and apply the same strategic thinking you use for your child to set yourself up for success. And I think this also works for your support workers. And this morning, my support worker says to me, "Oh, today the schedule was for my benefit, not Josiah's." And I was just like, Yeah, wow, that's great because I actually it takes the mental load off of like, have we done the gel yet? Tick. Have we done the shoes? Okay, you can see shoes, but there's has he had his medication? Tick. And so there's more transparency and everyone's more on the same page. And the final, yeah, and 4 is just embrace the process. So expecting instant results is not not our story with Fragile X kids. It takes time. So if your child is throwing the visuals or doesn't look like it engaging, stick with it. It does mean that they understand, but it takes time to build and understand habits. So we need to be extra patient with our child and with ourselves. So some of the key takeaways: matching their stage. So don't try a written thing if actually they need a shoe picture. Start simple, build gradually. Leverage motivation. So what's your child's iPad equivalent? And then integrate that in the process. Practicality over perfection. Visuals don't need to be Pinterest perfect. They just need to be functional and work for your family. And choose one thing. What's the biggest pain point at this point? Address it with the visual and commit to giving it a proper try. So I've mentioned a couple of times, it's taken us 8 years. It's taken us 10 years. Like there's some things that are now quicker because we've just been doing the process, but it does, yeah, really, it takes time. So the social story app that I have used a lot is called, and the icons there is called Social Stories. And this one does cost about $50. It's not cheap. You can change the font, which is very important, because it's just really yucky font. But it's just a very simple format of a picture, and then you put the words underneath, and then you can also record it. So that's just really helpful for then reading through a story and making it on the fly. The things I've not mentioned earlier, but it's so important with it, I think with our kids, is they have great sense of humor. And so incorporating that in the social stories have just made a really big difference. And so you can see here is a pitch. It's a little random. I will get to that. But no wheelchair for Kit is a joke we made up when we were planning to travel. Just I was going to use this wheelchair, but I needed it was new for him to use. And he likes to, there's no school for Kit. It's a big joke for him. So we used his language and then used a real picture, add a little cross through it. And yeah, it does. They have a great sense of humor. And so just using that kind of stuff, they love it. And you'll see, and actually they use Josiah's sense of humor at school as well. He loves a good fart joke. So I'll keep it PG, but we will often write things like, brush teeth and then fart and then whatever it is. And he just, yeah, it's fun and it helps him stay engaged. So that is all from me in terms of content wise. I do have handouts and the templates that we can share